nice to see such a great crowd here. And I really enjoy doing this event as well, and we get a lot of good questions, so I encourage you to ask questions of me and my good friend Senator Jaramillo on whatever, and if we don't know the answer, we're more than happy to get the information for you as a follow-up. I can't speak for my friend here, but I don't know everything that goes on in the legislature, so I do my best to stay on top of things, but it's a very fast-moving operation, especially during the 30-day. So as Ren said, we had a 30-day session, and the 30-day, for those of you who don't know, and I bet there are very few of those, it's focused primarily on budget and revenue issues. That's kind of the theme of the 30-day. That's embedded in our state constitution. Something that a number of us find too constraining and would frankly like to change, and we can talk about that later if you wish. But that's the main focus of the session, and then there is what we call what matters the governor chooses to put on. Some people refer to it the call, or whether or not we receive a message. That is also part of it, and we find that too constraining as well, because it gives a lot of power to the governor and less power to us, and it also gives her leverage, which is not something we maybe like so much. So that's what we did, and so I am on, I think many of you know, I'm the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. That is a very busy committee, and it touches on a large range of issues, very broad range of issues. So it's a heavy committee to manage. We are often the last stop on a bill. So as I said, it's a heavy committee, and it takes a lot of my time just to prioritize the agenda and manage that committee. The other committee that I am on is the House Taxation and Revenue Committee. I used to chair that committee. I enjoy it tremendously. I think tax policy is very interesting, and I hope to continue working on it. I handed out a 2-pager. I have in my possession a 10-pager. So this is my summary of things that kind of, struck me as significant, but there are probably other things based on other people's interests, so happy to try to answer questions related to that. We have passed a budget that's in greater than $10 billion. That's historic in terms of size. I think it represents about more than a 6% increase in spending from last year's budget. We're starting to trim back some. There is concern that our oil and gas revenues are starting to slow down. I don't want to cause a great deal of concern with that, but we're starting to see some tapering off of oil and gas production in the state, and we should anticipate that over time. Our projections are that, we have about 7 or 8 years of, a big boom, and we're planning for that. And so when I was preparing for this talk, I was, of course, reviewing what we accomplished and what we worked on and what seemed to be priorities. And so I'm going to term this the year of the fund. So we have a lot of revenues, and as you see, we have over $3 billion in reserves right now, and monies continue to accumulate. We cannot spend all that money, nor do we want to spend all that money, because we need to be prudent. We do not want to encumber our budget with recurring expenses and then have a great cliff when things go, when our revenues start to taper off. So the strategy, I think it's both conscious and unconscious, frankly, is to start putting monies away for priority. So, my friend here created or worked on something called the Law Enforcement Fund. Okay, so we're endowing uses of monies. We have a early childhood and care fund that we have funded. We have a housing fund that we have funded. We are creating these various areas of prioritization and putting monies in those funds. Why? So when the monies taper off in the future, which we know is going to happen, we will have access to those other funds. Most of them don't have locks on them, meaning if there was a real crisis, we could sweep some of the money back if something really were to occur that we had to address that was significant. But that's been the approach. Last year we had a very important bill that increases our investment in the severance tax fund, which is an important fund for us. We also have something called the Rainy Day Fund, and I think it's called the Tax Stabilization Fund or something like that. That was created, I don't know, before I entered the legislature, and it is intended to deal with shortfalls in our budget that often due to the fact that we rely so heavily on the oil and gas as a revenue stream. So we are planning for the future. People may object to how we're doing that, but that is our goal, to make sure that we have resources in the future. We know very well that this is the boom that we have going is not in perpetuity. We had a tax package that was at about the $220 million level. That's a small tax package for us, at least in since I've been in the legislature, which is 5 years going on 6 years. That's also in recognition of the fact that we need to start thinking about recurring expenses. Most tax policy is a recurring expense. So we gave some income tax relief. We provided a lot of tax credits. And if the theme on the tax package, if you're looking for a theme, it tended to focus a lot on environmental issues. So EV tax credits, geothermal tax credits. I worked on a bill that would provide tax support if there's a company interested in developing large-scale storage. So we are trying to expand our renewable energy sources, but what's the issue there, and you all know this, is there are issues when the wind stops. There are issues when it's dark. So we need to be able to store energy on a large scale. So I worked with a company that does that, and we provided some support for those kinds of initiatives. And that's kind of on my first page of my little summary there. Education, we continue to work on improving education and making significant investments in education. The governor's theme this year was what I'm calling community safety. You might call it public safety, and that was kind of two areas. One is gun safety measures. There were a number of bills that got messages. There was a waiting period bill, there was an assault rifle restriction bill, there was a no guns in polling places bills. There were a number of bills like that got messages and were considered germane during the session. And then there were what I refer to as kind of your criminal enhancement bills. Those got less support in the legislature, and we can talk about why that might be the case. But and I think the governor's a little bit frustrated with that. But we certainly, there's an issue about crime in the state. There's no question about that. Gun-related crime is a significant issue, of course, and we do need to address it. Healthcare, I think that sort of flies under the radar for a lot of people in the public, but we have been doing a lot in terms of healthcare support. So, for example, we created a system wherein rural hospitals are going to get more money through Medicaid. And our Medicaid reimbursements are going up. And that, for people in Los Alamos, that's less of an issue. We certainly do have Medicaid eligible people here, but across the state it is a significant issue. We have many, many people, I think it's like at the 50% level, that receive services through Medicaid. And it's important that we support our service providers so that they can make the sufficient living, and that affects our providers, and of course we want to support our providers to the fullest extent, and local rural hospitals. So we have done a lot in that arena in terms of shoring up funding for rural hospitals, providers. We support something called the Patient Compensation Fund, which is a fund that is used to support doctors in their malpractice claims. So we are very conscious of that. As I said, these are sort of technical issues that I think often are not acknowledged, in the press and otherwise. In terms of the environment, we hear a lot from the environmental groups that we need to support our department, our environmental department, and I agree with that. And we increased their budget by 27% this year, which is significant and that's important. We need staff, we need to be able to pay staff well so that they can do enforcement activities and follow up on our many initiatives. I was a co-sponsor on the Clean Transportation Fuel Standards. So happy to maybe close out there, but there was a wide range of bills that we passed this year. The budget is still very healthy and will continue to be, I think, in certainly the near future. And with that, I'll pass the baton to my dear friend and colleague, Senator Jaramillo, and then I imagine we'll be available for questions.
It's at the end, Senator.
Good morning, can you hear me? I think I did it. So, it's always nice to be in the Roundhouse when you have a good friend with you, and so that's Representative Chandler. And so to be able to walk into her office and talk about issues that are affecting northern New Mexico or Los Alamos County, to have somebody that we can bounce ideas off with. So I want to, first of all, thank Representative Chandler for not only being an amazing state representative, but being a really good friend of mine in the Roundhouse, because she is the voice of reason for me so many times when I need guidance, and so I want to thank you for that publicly, Representative.
Scary thought, huh? I'm the voice of reason.
So here's what's happening. I want to give some additional budget highlights that happened last session, not this previous one, but last year's. You remember that one of my major initiatives was to ensure that every student in New Mexico had access to free breakfast and free lunch. That was a major initiative of mine that went into law, and now we're seeing other states who are modeling after our bill, since we put in that healthy component in there, to ensure that we can reach out to local farmers to get local produce in there, and ensuring that it's not just processed foods our students are eating. So we're fully funding right now New Mexico's Universal Free School Meal Program on a reoccurring basis, ensuring that every New Mexico student can focus on their studies and not on their stomachs. Now that was an issue that we had in Los Alamos Public Schools, as they were concerned they would have to put the bill for feeding every student when they hadn't written that into their budget, and so that's no longer going to be an issue. We worked with an additional $5 million, which will be going into food banks across the state of New Mexico. The $50 million that the representative talked about for rural health care and hospitals. What we're also going to see is seniors are going to see more SNAP benefits. They were seeing $25 a month to help them with food. We're going to see that that's going to increase to $100 a month to help seniors with food. Reoccurring funding and support for veterans for suicide prevention strategies, transportation initiatives, burial equity, and homeless initiatives are going to be taking place with what we passed in that budget. And so I want to talk about a few bills that I sponsored. And in addition to that, I carried the confirmations for the governor on the Senate floor and led Senate confirmations as the vice chair of the Rules Committee. And then also I serve as a member of the Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee. So I saw 67 confirmations went through this session, which is a large amount of people going into committees or commissions that are going to be serving on behalf of the governor. So this year I introduced the Aging Department background checks, which is Senate Bill 241. Now what this bill ensures is that every employee or volunteer who works for the Department of Aging and Long-Term Services will have to get a background check. Right now that wasn't a requirement, so we have people going into senior homes who are helping with paying bills, taking them to doctor's appointments, and they didn't have a background check. So this bill was supported by the cabinet secretary, and it made it to the governor's desk, and I'm assuming it will be signed into law. This is going to make sure that our vulnerable adults are protected and their personal information is protected. So other bills that I worked with, and so the representative touched on one of them. Two rolled into House Bill 2, which is the budget bill. That's $25 million that's going to go to the recruitment of law enforcement officers, probation officers, and parole officers, something that we're seeing a need across the state of New Mexico. I also, another bill of mine rolled into House Bill 2, which was an additional $25 million for the recruitment of firefighters across the state of New Mexico. Now what we're seeing in rural New Mexico are volunteers aren't stepping up to volunteering to these rural firefighter departments anymore. Prices have increased, people aren't volunteering, they're taking on 2 jobs. This would ensure that firefighters could recruit and get paid professional firefighters in. Now, that's not saying that volunteers aren't professional. Professional in this way just means they would be paid for the services they're providing our communities. Now, I was happy to run the energy storage industrial revenue bond with our representative. I served as one of 2 Senate sponsors. We were happy to see that go into effect, and the bill provides that gross receipt tax deduction for the sales of energy storage equipment to governments. So I'm happy we could team up on that. And then another one that I ran, I'm a former county commissioner. And so what this bill does is it would change the Constitution from setting the pay scale of commissioners to put that on the shoulders of legislators to allowing counties to determine how much they would pay their county commissioners. So if you were to look at a large county like Bernalillo, we would expect those commissioners to get paid more than a smaller county, maybe down south, that doesn't have the budget to really increase for that pay of commissioners. This would give that power to counties to determine the rate of their commissioners. If that's signed into law, it will then go, or if that's signed by the governor, it will then go to voters in the general election to see if all of you agree that that's something that should be amended in our Constitution. Now, Representative Chandler and I were contacted by Los Alamos residents who had issues with fentanyl and wanted to make sure that we started the conversation about the dangers of fentanyl in our communities. So I ran Senate Memorial 7, which is the Fentanyl Poisoning Awareness Week. What this would have done is it would have teamed up with the Department of Education to ensure that the week of October 14 through 18 was known as the Fentanyl Poisoning Awareness Week. Now, this would encourage every school board to ensure that their governing bodies would go in and teach students the dangers about fentanyl, the risks associated with it, addiction to fentanyl. That didn't make it through, but it started the conversation. And I also introduced Senate Bill 231, which is the school drug education bill. This would also encourage elementaries, middle, and high schools to do a 1-week curriculum based on the dangers of opioids, focusing mostly on fentanyl. The bill would allow for outside partners to come into the school and help teach. If you look at Rio Arriba County, they have Rack Stop, which is a prevention program that would have allowed Rack Stop to come into any school, including a neighboring county like Los Alamos, to provide education to students and educators. Now, in addition to the bills that I ran, we were awarded capital outlay funds. So I was able to support projects which include water infrastructure projects, education, county and city infrastructure, and public safety. In Los Alamos, I was able to allocate $300,000 to the Jemez Mountain Fire Protection Pipeline Project, an additional $150,000 to the University of New Mexico, Los Alamos for roof repairs. We also provided $100,000 more to the Council of Governments, and that's important because they provide grant writers to Los Alamos County. If they find a grant that they can apply for, but they need the grant writer will go in and get that done. To date, I believe it's $32 million that our grant writers have secured for northern New Mexico communities. And so believe it or not, our local high school is going to be tapping into one of those grant writers. They asked for an electric bus with the Eco Club. And so I guaranteed the Eco Club the grant writer if they found the grant. And it sounds as if though they found the grant, and the grant writer is going to start writing on that. Here's some fun stuff. So the representative teases and says that I am the Miss Congeniality, which I'll take that title, but I really wish I could get the Miss USA crown, but I'll take the Miss Congeniality title. I was happy in the Senate to recognize Los Alamos High School as the AP Small School District of the Year. Nationally, a certificate was read into the Senate. We celebrated the students, staff, and teachers in the Senate. I was happy to have leaders come into the chamber for Los Alamos County Day, which was on February 14th. I was happy to visit with the Los Alamos Native American Culture Club to talk about the importance of representation and why representation matters. It was nice to have them come in. And Los Alamos High School's government class also came, and they sat in through one of the chamber discussions and debates and was able to meet with them after to see what they thought about. So it was really exciting. And so when we're there, we think of ourselves as New Mexicans, not as our party line. And so it was nice to have the youngest woman from the Republican women of Los Alamos County join me on the floor. She spent a full Saturday with me, and when she was asked by the Republican Party what made her decide to shadow a Democratic senator, her response was, the senator represents all New Mexicans, and so I wanted to sit with the senator who saw both sides of the aisle and not just thought about party lines. So that was really nice, and that was my experience. And so here's just two more that I want to brag about, Representative. I was named the Milagro. I earned the Milagro Award in the Senate. The Milagro Award goes to a senator who's overcome challenges but still pushes senators to be their best. And I don't know if you know this, but my brother passed away in October. And grief really struck in January. And there were times in committee that I was sitting there that tears would just roll down my face without even knowing that they were coming down. He showed up every session in the gallery, gave me a thumbs up when something was happening, or gave me that older brother nod of approval. And so there were times I caught myself looking up in the gallery for him, and then I'd remember. And so that is why I won the Milagro Award, is I was able to push through and continue to work for New Mexicans. I was then also named the Spirit of the New Mexico Senate, which was given to me by Senator Pinto on behalf of her late grandfather, Senator Pinto. Now, he worked on both sides of the aisle and ensured that he would keep peace and calmness. She's from the Navajo Nation, and in her speaking about me being the spirit of the New Mexico Senate, she talked about being able to work on both sides of the aisle and keeping peace, calmness, and a sense of humor, which is what helped me get that. And so it was an honor representing all of you. It was a short session, and I'm looking forward to going back in the interim and working for all of you and all of the needs that you identify. Oh, and don't forget, at the end, take a selfie.
Are we going to do questions?
I hope so.
Great.
My favorite part.
Me too. Bill.
Okay, a couple of questions. Chris and Leo, you were talking about this as, the year of the reserve. And so I know one of the bills there was a bill to create an endowment for tribal education, which did not make it. And I love your insights into that. And then the other thing is thinking about reserves. Norway has done a wonderful job on their sovereign wealth fund. And I wonder if there's ever been a group from the legislature that's gone to Norway to learn about what they have done, because it seems like they've been very wise in how they've used their oil and gas revenues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You want to start, or?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm proud to say that the Tribal Education Fund made it through the House, maybe unanimously, if not unanimously, almost unanimously. This is going to be another theme. It got stuck in the Senate. The reasons for that are not fully clear to me, but I believe, at least this is sort of what I've been hearing from some of my colleagues, is it had more to do with disagreements between the tribes than anything else in terms of how the fund should be administered and the like. And I think the sense of the sponsors were, we need to work on this and have some consensus before we bring it back. Now, I don't mean to be speaking for them, but that's my interpretation of what happened on that bill. Certainly, it would have been helpful. We have our Yazzie Martinez obligations that we need to continue to be cognizant of, and that would have helped in those commitments. The second point, Bill, is I think a really good one, and I'm going to read up on it over the interim and look at that as something as an approach. I'm not sure I'm going to ask to get sent to Norway, but because I could probably learn about it just in terms of reading. But anyway, very interesting idea. Thanks.
I think we should ask to go to Norway. On the Tribal Education Fund, the reason why it died out in the Senate is because the House sponsor decided to pull the bill. Because there were concerns, smaller pueblos thought that it was going to benefit mostly the Navajo Nation, and were concerned that smaller pueblos wouldn't be getting some of that funding that they needed. And so the decision was made to pull the bill so that the smaller pueblos could have a voice in the decision-making. Senator Pinto of the Navajo Nation had similar issues with the bill. She was also concerned that pueblos wouldn't get their share of the fund, and so they're all going to come together to come up with an agreement on what they can do to ensure that the bill passes in the 60-day session.
Susie.
I have two questions, and thanks for your presentation, you guys, and thanks for your time and service, and just great overview. Really appreciate it. One's just a little question. What do you think about there was an initiative with Think New Mexico for high school financial literacy requirements. And I know there were some changes to high school graduation requirements related to math and algebra 2, I think. But how do you think about that, and do you think that will come back next year? And do you think it'll be successful?
You go first, I went first the
Sure.
last time, so.
So I did support the bill. I had a number of parents who reached out who talked about how their students in middle school think a debit card has an endless amount of money, and if you can just go to any ATM and
Students, they're adults.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I used to be one of those adults too. So they really talked about how there's no real financial literacy when you come into a school setting. The threat then that these parents brought about was then they go onto a college campus and you're offered a credit card and you think that the world is your oyster and you're gonna get that credit card, you don't think about interest rates, you don't think about a monthly payment. I supported the bill. As a former educator, I think that's
Who
important.
carried that bill? Whose bill was that?
Mimi Stewart,
Oh, Mimi?
Senator
Okay.
Stewart. And so the bill will make its way back next session. But you know, even the Public Education Department Cabinet Secretary supported the bill. And I think it's something that everyone as parents or even those in our banking industry can agree on, that financial literacy is something that's important that we should teach at an early age.
Thank you, I agree, it's really important. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm gonna raise an issue with these suggestions, and that is, we have a limited curriculum in the schools, and we have limited time. So I do think we need to come up with a way to prioritize, because I often get, the number of ideas I get about what should be in the curriculum are significant. So I hear ya, and maybe that's right, but also we still have some basic education we have to be doing in the schools. And as we move forward, we have to always be mindful of that. Well, you know, our reading scores are not great in this state. Our math scores are not great in this state. You know, focusing on basic educational needs is also, I think, a very important and critical thing. So I get a little leery with some of these suggestions, and I go to my educator friends and say, okay, how are you gonna fit that in the curriculum? Because we really need to make sure that our children are getting, you know, their basic educational needs set before. And I guess you could argue this is a basic need. Parents should be doing this too. You know, teaching their kids about how to manage money strikes me as something that is a parental need. And I'm not arguing with you, Susie, I'm just saying, you know, I think we should always be a little skeptical when we get these suggestions, and we need to have a clear understanding how we're gonna fit it into the schedule.
Sam.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
Susie.
my second question, completely different. I love the emphasis on thinking forward, planning ahead, anticipating that we're gonna have revenue drop-offs in 7 or 8 years probably, and making sure that we're investing in resources so we'll be prepared and try to kind of build from the floor, right, with housing and education and nutrition.
You said it better than I did,
and all
Susie.
that. But what about on the revenue side? I would presume there's forward thinking and proactive thinking about, you know, economic development, economic diversification, of course, you know, maybe in the energy storage arena as an example, but on the
And
tax
manufacturing.
side, you know,
We've
so-
done a number of things to try to incentivize manufacturing, including manufacturing of you know, renewable energy type things. But, you know, you've done this on the local level, the council has. It's really hard. Economic development is really hard, so you always need a two-prong approach in terms of that. Because it takes a long time to induce companies to come here, and it's a struggle, and frankly, they're not gonna come until we have an educated workforce and a trained workforce. That is one of the key factors in bringing, I hear a lot from local businesses about, well, we're not gonna recruit so long as we have XYZ tax policy. Tax policy is about number 8 in recruitment criteria for companies. But a trained workforce and crime, those are higher on that, and so that's what we need to be focusing on, and we have been, and I think it will bear fruit. The governor has been successful in bringing companies, and you know about Facebook and Amazon. I think there's a manufacturing company coming into the state soon, I think in Los Lunas. So we've been doing it, but it's tough work. It's tough work, economic development.
Thank you.
Kevin.
What would you guys say are the activities that you undertake that really will have the best positive effect for locally owned businesses, like and particularly in rural areas in the state?
That's a good question. So legislation that went in front of me didn't really touch on small businesses much. I didn't carry anything that was small business. Let me think about that one.
So I feel, we need, as I said, developing our workforce is something. So we have been investing in apprenticeship programs, which I think benefit not just small businesses, but also large businesses. So that certainly job training and those kinds of things. We did increase our investment in the LEDA program, so more funds have been put into LEDA, which I know that there are businesses, including this one, I believe, interested in developing access to LEDA monies. So in terms of that, that's where I would be focusing on job development and assistance to businesses who can show that they are creating jobs in their community, which is what LEDA is in terms of a program.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
One thing, have you really looked at, is job creation the real important thing to be focused on in this day and age? At one time, it absolutely was much more important, but now we're at a stage where there aren't enough people to fill the jobs. So I think I would wonder if there's some looking at rethinking why we're doing these things. Is it to just create more and more and more jobs, or is it to really enrich the communities and make our state a more solid, sustainable place? I think the old speak in economic development is a little bit dated.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I don't want to hog them.
I just want to say that's a really good point, right? I think that's a great point, and I hadn't thought about that. And I'd love to meet with you offline to hear more about your thoughts and what I could take back to Santa Fe with me, and then make that a discussion. But that's a great point that you made.
Yeah, I agree. I would like to hear more about what you're thinking, but I would also point out the question is, do we not have people who are available to work, or do we not have people who are entering the workforce for various other reasons? And so that, I think we need to be thinking about that. And I think this statement's going to create some controversy, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is, the paid family and medical leave bill is a bill that will help small businesses. I get pushback from some small businesses on that point, but not all, because some see that providing state support for people who are having children, babies, or need to care for their loved ones will bring people back into the workforce because they have a system to access income when they need it. And part of the problem, at least from the feedback I have been getting, having worked on that bill for quite some time now, is some members are not entering the workforce because they have a loved one to care for, or they have family commitments that are drawing on them, so that they are taking a hit financially to stay home to address those things. So I just want to put that out there as a point. I get pushback from some businesses on that, but other businesses embrace that as a concept. So love to hear your thoughts, Kevin, on other things, but I do think that is something that is important for small businesses in the state.
Thank you. Sam?
Senator, Representative, thank you very much for your commitment to the health and well-being of our children, especially where you're stemming from. I want to build on that. First of all, as a response, Representative, to your comment about adults or parents educating their children on financial literacy. As a child of divorce who comes from parents who, one is very financially literate, the other one is not at all, parents cannot teach what they don't know. And so I'd like to hear what your thoughts on how to balance that is in response to what was said about financial education in schools, but also if there's a conversation going on anywhere about the greater mental health and well-being of our children. It stems, we see it reflected in the fentanyl usage, obviously, but we also see it in just the pressures that are on kids, the wide range of access to information, in particular misinformation, that they have, and I would like to know what the conversation is at the House and in the Senate.
Well, I'll address part of that. I agree, parents don't understand financial literacy either, but my point was, I mean, there's a multi-prong approach to dealing with financial literacy, and the schools cannot bear every piece of the responsibility. That's where I'm getting with that. So definitely we need to be looking at that, but there are other ways to teach financial literacy. On the issue of mental health, that is a problem or an issue that we have been struggling with for quite some time. I mean, our mental health system was, I don't know how to say it, was really negatively impacted by the last administration, and we're still rebuilding that system. But we need to get more providers out into the communities, and we need to be educating. So we have been, I'm trying to think, I was reviewing in terms of trying to get more social workers and other healthcare providers in terms of, we've been creating actually financial assistance programs for them so that we can train more folks in the state who will then be out and about trying to assist our many individuals who have emotional and mental health care needs. But it's a real struggle for us to get the necessary resources there. I don't know if you want to add
Sure.
to that.
So I was contacted by a counselor who is an Espanola alum who now works in Albuquerque. And her concern is, as school counselors, they can't provide any type of mental health services to students. They can just listen, and then they refer them to a mental health care provider. And there's not enough of them. Now that's a major issue. And so Senator Ortiz y Pino unfortunately is retiring, but he would try to work on a bill where any mental health care provider who studied in the state and would stay in the state would get some sort of either reimbursement or help with their tuition, and the same with social workers. And although he's gone, I think that that's still going to carry true, that somebody else will ensure that that bill goes forward, and we'll hope that gets signed. But there's just not enough providers, which is scary. And
Or facilities.
Or facilities. And it's not that we haven't had the conversations, we just don't have the resources. And so we could throw money at mental health care, but we just don't have the professionals in place to execute for us.
As a follow-up to that, is there anything aside from simply bringing in more mental health care providers that would contribute to the mental well-being of our kids? I think the issue's not always adding something, but
Yep.
perhaps taking away something. Is there any conversation going on there, or is that something you'd be open to?
I'm open to suggestions, frankly. This is not an area that I consider myself to have expertise in. There are some things I know a fair amount about, but this is where I would need input from someone like you or some people in the community about what could be helpful.
Do you know what's interesting to me is people now just start talking about their mental health as if they were to talk about a common cold, right? Which is a major step that people are having the conversation. And here's one example. Remember I told you during committee tears would come down my face? There was no shame in me telling people in the committee room, I'm dealing with the death of a brother and I'm grieving right now. And people respected that. And so I think that New Mexicans are starting to think of mental health as just health, period. And I think that people being able to just talk about their emotions and talk about what's happening around them is a major step in everyone's direction on ensuring that we start addressing mental health. But I want to listen to your thoughts as well.
Well, and just along those, I'm very proud of the fact that we have passed legislation that requires insurance companies to treat mental health claims on the same basis as, physical conditions. So, we certainly, I think as a legislature are very cognizant of the fact that mental health is a very important issue for us to address.
Thank you.
Sandy?
Thank you for your work this past session, and I hope there can be a focus on mental health resources because, children's problems are families' problems, and with the epidemic of suicide, it's so important that we take active steps, to improve our mental health as a region and a community. But actually, I raised my hand to share that UNM Los Alamos has an online financial literacy program that anyone in the community can access for free. And there are also, I think Enterprise Bank also has some online training about financial literacy. So for clubs who want to go through the process with a group of kids, you can do that. Our teachers have so much on their backs right now, trying to manage a large classroom and hit all of the points. I think some things have to be dealt with on a community level. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Danielle?
Hi. I'm going to ask a slightly different question, but I also want to thank you for recognizing that teachers have a lot on their plates. My mom was a teacher for 33 years. And she retired because the system had become just too difficult, right? Not because she didn't love teaching people. I want to switch gears and talk about communities and local governments. We know a lot of Los Alamos County is very lucky. We have great resources, we have great staff, but a lot of communities around the state have capacity issues. So you have this great fund of money, and there's capital outlay, there's water trust board loans, there's all sorts of funding available for projects, but there is a dearth of really good local government staff workers across the state, and that includes project managers. And I know some of our local communities have courses, but it's really an issue where even if they get a grant, I think the COGs are doing a great job with the grant work. Some of them can't actually use the grants that they get because they don't have the people to actually enact that work. I saw that there was some effort with DFA to change one of their departments to provide more project management assistance. Is that something that you foresee the state working on, or do you think that that's a workforce development issue that you'll be working on in the legislature, or are you relying on, again, local governments to work that out on their own?
Do you want to go, or that's a tough one?
That is a tough one. But I want to just say something about local government in this area. And so since I'm able to represent 4 counties, the major issue I hear from local governments outside of Los Alamos is they can't compete with Los Alamos National Laboratory. So the pay is just way too great for any county to try to recruit and retain, let's just say, a project manager, when the laboratory can offer them up to $65,000 more. And so it's not that cities aren't trying, they just are losing employees to a large national laboratory. Your points are great, I haven't really even thought about them. And so I'd love to sit with you more offline and see what we could possibly do, because you're right, there's so many reauthorizations that I'm doing in neighboring counties because they're not executing the funds that have been allocated because they just don't have the resources or the workforce or manpower behind it to get it done.
So we've offered to do lots of things, and they say, but what we need are like 3 more full-time employees that are going to stay here. And that's not something we can solve, so maybe it's something we can solve together.
I'd love to sit with you.
I'm trying to draw on my memory banks, but I think there were some efforts this year to look at promoting, on the state level, assisting local governments in implementing their capital outlay requests. And so there is a bill out there, or some legislation. I'm trying to, it's my memory's being jogged. I mean, you probably were following that, Danielle. There is some assistance now, because we're very concerned, as my colleague here was saying, Los Alamos County is not an issue. We give the capital outlay, and it's going to be managed appropriately. But I have little communities that I've given hundreds of thousands, and I mean hundreds of thousands of dollars to, for water projects and things like that, infrastructure support, and they're having trouble spending the money. And it's for multiple reasons. One is finding contractors continues to be an issue, and that's not that's statewide on every level. And the other is they don't have the staff to be able to manage a project. So there is some movement, and I'll follow up because I know was some legislation that looked at that.
I think it was for DFA to
yeah. So I think it's a good idea, and we recognize that especially our smaller communities need support in getting some of these projects off of the ground, for sure.
Okay. John, did you have a question?
I did, I was gonna comment earlier on the mental health element, and then I have something about housing after. Mental health, I went through a real tough breakup pretty recently, and I found that having groups to go to, like a church group or something, was probably the most helpful thing for me. Having a support group like Mr. Jaramillo was, his friends in the house, it really helped me more than any of the shrinks I saw or any of the counselors I saw, quite frankly. Just knowing that I had a good peer group and finding that. But I don't know, can do with that what you do. But that was most helpful for me, so maybe facilitating some of that. And then my second comment or question really is about housing. As I sat this morning reading the morning news, as I normally do, I saw that the governor said there's an immediate need for 40,000 houses in this. But I will believe it. What happened this session in housing that you maybe enlighten me about as a
Yeah.
member?
So if you don't mind, Representative, I can talk about the Senate Bill 216. That was the NFFA Affordable Housing Project. And what that bill does is it amends the New Mexico Finance Authority Act by adding housing as a public project eligible for financing and adding nonprofit housing developers as qualified entities. Now the bill also adds affordable housing plans as a qualified use of local government plan, as a qualified use of the local government planning fund.
That's Senate Bill 260.
That's Senate Bill 216.
Well, of course, he's highlighting the Senate work, but House Bill 195 is also a housing fund that we
Sorry,
have.
which one?
House Bill 195 is a bill that the House sponsored in support of housing. So the state is stepping up in terms of providing funding to, for rehabilitation as well as new housing stock. Definitely high on the radar of the governor and the legislature.
Oh yeah, well what about Senate Bill? I'm just kidding.
So
Go ahead, John.
I'll review those, forgive
Sure.
my ignorance, I'm not really in the
well.
political scene, but I'll definitely review those. And my thoughts are there's some new construction methodologies that
Mhm.
we can utilize to build houses for a lot cheaper, less labor, because
Yep.
labor is a big problem for me and everyone in construction, obviously, everyone in every industry, I suppose. But in those bills, is there anything that talks about alternative types of building methodologies at all, or would I need to propose something like that to you guys?
I don't know, but I would like to hear more about what you're speaking of. We certainly have been trying to encourage the development of green components to the rehabilitation and creation of housing stock, you know, like charging stations, providing tax credit to certain kinds of enhancements to properties that would, you know, improve energy efficiency and so on. But in terms of details, I'd have to go look up some things probably to refresh my recollection on that. But certainly there are discussions of things like that. So happy to hear more from you. And your name's John
Watson.
Watson. Okay.
New chamber member,
Okay, great.
Welcome.
Stephanie.
I have a sort of follow-on question to that. There is in New Mexico, there are very few tenant protections
Mhm.
in New Mexico, and so people, so tenants are really at the mercy of landlords, and when the housing stock is so low, that is quite unsafe and unjust. The House had, I believe, a source of income discrimination bill
Yeah.
that failed.
Right.
And that would have prevented landlords from discriminating against Section 8 voucher holders, which in 2 cities, I believe Las Cruces and Albuquerque, it's illegal. It is definitely legal in Los Alamos because some landlords brag about it. So I'm just wondering why that failed, and do you think it will come back?
So I don't know which committees it went through where it failed, but it was something I would support. You know, I heard from 2 single moms who are educators in Los Alamos. They were born and raised here, single moms raising kids, and they're talking about how rent continues to escalate. and how they feel like they're being pushed out of the community they call home. And they can't go to Espanola because there's no housing in Espanola. It's landlocked by the pueblos, and then it's old family houses that are there, so it's generations of families with no new development coming in. Santa Fe is just as expensive as Los Alamos, and they both said, we don't want to be pushed as far as Rio Rancho. And so I supported the bill. I was hoping the bill would come over to the Senate, and so I hope that it makes its comeback next session.
I fully anticipate those kinds of measures are gonna come back. I mean, remember, it was a 30-day. It was rough trying to get, I mean, we had 5 or 6 gun safety bills, some crime. It was rough. But definitely, I think there will be a movement on that issue, as well as there have been some landlord-tenant improvements that, enhancing the safeguards in our Landlord-Tenant Act. That has been something that's been on our agenda for a couple of years now. I expect that to come back. And also, I think we need to be thinking about, mobile home protections. That's an issue as well in terms of how landlords frankly can take advantage of I've heard issues even in our town on things like that. So those are 3 things, and I fully expect that there'll be greater movement. And I view that, I'm going to be chairing our interim committee on courts, corrections, and justice this year, and that's going to be a topic that I'd like to have a better understanding of, sort of housing justice, if you want to, you can call it that. And so I hope to have maybe a program on that during the session so we're better informed when we get back into really the 60-day.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Let's go with the high school student right here.
Okay. Yes, about financial literacy in schools, I guess. I think it's good to teach in schools. I'm not in the class, but I've heard from friends in the class that they don't really learn anything. So the curriculum, I guess, needs to change or something. But.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks for that feedback.
Yes.
That's helpful.
And we do have time to just squish in Cliff on.
All right, so thank you both for your service. I have been a business person for 5 years. I know how challenging it is to convince people to go with you. I'm glad you, both of you actually are keen to education. Many of us see that's an important issue as well. I see that's a foundation for our future. As a biologist, grew up in China for 30 years and I come here, live here for 27 years already. So in the last 15 years, I realized actually the scientific education or whatever the school is taught. Give you a parable, it's actually is the most powerful app. It's an app, most powerful app. But there's another thing is more fundamental. That's the operational system built up for a person. What is that? So that is actually what do you believe? I eventually realized the religious foundation in this society is the strongest root for the society to grow. In the last 15 years, I realized that. So for both of you, I don't know where are you in that direction. I would like to see from the regulation actually promote and protect the religious freedom, not in the school, and also the religious group reach out to the public school for those activities.
Okay.
So that's very important for our future.
Thank you, Cliff.
I appreciate your point of view. I think religion is a personal choice and perspective, and our foundational document acknowledges the separation of church and state, and I, as someone who supports the Constitution, that's how I see it. I think it's on the religious institutions to reach out as they deem appropriate on an individual basis, and I don't think there's a large role for the schools in that.
Anything to say?
Well, agreed. We did have the Sikh community who was going into an elementary in Espanola and teaching them yoga, how to time out, how to breathe, and take a step back. They started to see that the number of incidents they were having on the playground had decreased.
Yeah.
But then the Catholic parishioners who were part of that school didn't want the Sikh community coming in. So I think we'd have a major issue on which religions we'd bring into schools, so it's best to just have that separation of church and state. But before we leave, I have some numbers I want to share with you. Although it was the short 30-day session, the House and the Senate introduced 777 pieces of legislation, 354 by senators and 423 in the House. 111 executive messages were received. 237 bills were considered not to be germane, and 107 pieces of legislation passed both chambers. So although it was 30 days, those are some big numbers and moving super quick on delivering for New Mexicans. So I just wanted to leave you with those numbers.
Well, as the grumpy legislature, I'm not sure all those statistics reflect well on everything we're doing. You know, we have to think strategically here, folks. And I'm as guilty as anyone of probably filing too many bills in a very short session.
And before y'all leave, whoever wants to take a selfie with me, I would love to have a selfie with you. So you don't have to, but before you leave, you can come down with me.
Very good. I just want to say thank you to both Senator Jaramillo and Representative Chandler for all their hard work and representing all of us. And before we get to the selfies, I'd like to have the 3 high school students that are with us today come down for a quick picture with the representative and senator. And thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day. So.